and thank you for coming to another episode of Coffee and Conversation podcast as alumni. My name is Diana Guzman Lugo, current Career Services Coordinator and third-year MDiv student, and I will allow our guests to introduce themselves. So, Lindsey, if you would like to start.
Yeah, I'm Lindsey Hardegree. I was a DMin student. I graduated in 2024. I serve as the executive director for the Episcopal Community Foundation for Middle and North Georgia. That's a ministry of the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta. I've been there for, it'll be 10 years in May, which is just kind of crazy to think about that. And I also do a lot of other things outside of my professional work. I'm sure that we'll get into some of that. But it did tie in some with my research that I did when I was at Candler, which was around spirituality outside of the church and kind of what the church can learn from that. So that's me.
I am Jenelle Holmes, and I graduated from Candler with an MDiv after pivoting halfway through from an MTS. And I graduated in 2015. I am currently the organizing pastor of a new worshiping community for about 10 years now called Ormwood Church. We're in Southeast Atlanta.
Well, to start, Jenelle, you said you pivoted from MTS to MDiv, so I guess I'm going to take advantage and ask right away, what led to that change and what truly, or who inspired in that change? What professors did you talk to?
Yeah. I would actually say the word pivot was kind of providential for me to use in that sentence because I've pivoted a lot in my life, which is one of the reasons why I planted a church, having thought I'd never be called to that. I pivoted in undergrad with my degree halfway through because I just felt like going from a religion degree to an English degree was the better fit. And it was. And I learned just as much, if not more, about God. I had to pivot in my early 20s because my spouse and I got pregnant. We didn't plan that. So he did his MDiv first, and then I did mine after him. And then I came into Candler thinking I was going to be studying gender and sexuality, especially around questions of the church and inclusivity. And from the very beginning, I had professors who at the end of my papers would be like, I feel like this would make a good sermon. Joy McDougall was one of them. Ted Smith was one of them. And so slowly, after about a year and a half, I realized that a lot of my questions and my research questions were very practical, and really where I wanted to answer them was in a sermon or in a small group or in a congregational setting. And so I pivoted halfway through and I transferred from MTS to MDiv. And it did take some finagling to get done in 3 years, but gosh darn it, I made it work with the support of beautiful people like Steve Krafchick. So yeah, that was my pivot. It was one of those things that I just had to follow my gut.
Thank you for sharing. I know sometimes for a lot of students, they come in and their route here at Candler doesn't end up like what they expected.
And I feel like that is just should be the assumed posture of the human life instead of the unusual one.
Yeah, well, one of the things that have been a recurring theme is just how transformative seminary and theology is. But Lindsey, I want to ask, what drew you to Candler for your DMin, and also what was your research focused on?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I actually first looked at Candler a million years ago when I went through seminary, when I did my MTS. And at the time, there were no distance options available. So this was like before the hybrid program existed and all of that. And so Candler had been like on my radar for a really long time. And I had been disappointed that I hadn't been able to come earlier in my academic career. So when I knew that I wanted to go back and do my DMin, this was actually the first and really only school that I looked at for that program. And a big part of the appeal is that the way that the DMin program is set up is that you have the ability, it's actually kind of expected that you'll be working full-time in whatever your ministry context is at the same time that you're doing the program. And as somebody who is lay. So I'm not ordained. I've not been on the discernment path. That's kind of never been my call, my journey. I have never been able to justify quitting everything and going to school full time because I have to still have a job. It's if you're going to become a pastor, if you're going to become a priest, that makes a little more sense to fully dedicate yourself 100% in that way. But as somebody who has a separate, even though it's related, career, the fact that the DMin program allowed you to kind of keep that going and to work in an environment that was that hybrid environment, but still academically rigorous, was really, really important to me. So that was kind of how I got to Candler in the first place. I mean, the reputation of Emory is amazing and phenomenal. So that kind of spoke for itself. And then I was really quite pleased when I got into the program and I realized just how diverse the student body, even just of my program, was. We had people from all different kinds of denominations, which meant that as we were digging in further into our own individual research focuses, I was just learning a lot about other people and other traditions. And having that exposure, I think, just kind of informs us in a lot of ways that makes us not only kind of a more empathetic and kind of more well-rounded person in general, but also helps to further kind of confirm the things that we believe about where we are in our faith traditions, because you're thinking about it in that way. So the other thing that kind of was interesting about my participation with that cohort is that at the time I was the only lay person in my class, which ties directly in kind of with my research focus. For the DMin program, most people, the focus of their research is something contextual to where they are working. So it's the parish that they're working in, the congregation they're working with. If they're, a DS, it's the group of congregations that they're supervising, kind of whatever that might look like. But for me, as somebody who does not have a congregation or a diocese or whatever that might be, my work was really more around like lay people in general, which, is kind of a lot of people in the world, if you think about it. And so really kind of focusing my work on what does spirituality look like in secular spaces, kind of outside of the church, and to not be afraid of that as a church, to not say, oh, this is competition, or this is a problem or a challenge, or we need to steer people away from this. Like, God is not limited by the four walls of our churches. And so to acknowledge that and to embrace the fact that we can find the holy in many, many places. And so what does that look like? What are people today being drawn to? And then what can the church learn from that? How do we take that and, like I said, not be afraid of it or try to discount it, but to find ways to embrace that and to engage that and to acknowledge that, the mission field of the church is out in the world where people are, and really kind of outwardly focusing that, like, rather than just training up people to be good Christians, whatever that might mean, but really thinking about how can you kind of live into God's mission as a church, as for yourself, in whatever that everyday context is that you're a part of. And so how can the church better prepare people, lay people, for that? So it was kind of like a big and rambling thing. It involved some of the things that I do. I also kind of like on the side, outside of my career, I have my own business where I help people doing organizing and productivity, mindful spending coaching. I'm one of Marie Kondo's certified consultants. And so that actually became part of my research for my DMin project, was talking with other consultants about the spirituality that's kind of inherent in the work of working with people as you're organizing their homes. So kind of it touched on a lot of different things. And I love that Candler was able to be so expansive in allowing me to do that, to be, just take it and run with it, and then figure out how do we talk about it in a way that can be meaningful for the church long term. So I have no idea if I actually answered your question or not. So there we go.
You did, and now I have more, but this is exactly why we're here. But I'm gonna ask both of you separately a little bit more about some of the classes you listed. So Jenelle, you listed preaching politics as one of the classes that really shaped you. And how do you see yourself calling back on that class now, when I think it's a really I mean, it's always a hard time to preach politics, but especially now.
It is truly a spicy time. Truly a spicy time. And this is I mean, I have now been a pastor. It's my second Trump presidency under which I've been a pastor. And so I don't, there has never really been a time where politics has not directly affected people's real lives in significant ways while I've been a pastor. And I think one of the things about the way that Ted Smith organized that class, which I'm sure it's evolved as he's been there, but it really was trying on both. We were setting a foundation of like, what does it mean to talk about politics? Like, what is politics, right? Politics is how we organize ourselves. And so I am just able to articulate to people who are like, you know, you do talk about politics sometimes in your sermons. That's interesting. I didn't have that growing up. It makes me a little uncomfortable. Even when I agree with you, I'm uncomfortable. Why am I so uncomfortable? And kind of helping them take a few steps back and look at politics not just as an emotional trigger, but as an explanation for how we organize ourselves. And if you talk about it that way, it's much easier to say how we organize ourselves matters in every sphere of our life. Political, at the church, like there's politics in church because we are organizing ourselves together. And so helping them kind of understand the broader definition of politics. And once you say that, it's immediately relevant. Like how we're organized in our city is relevant, how we're organized in our neighborhood is relevant. But he also had us try on different hats of how people speak and communicate. And one of my favorite class sessions was we were supposed to take on a style, and I'd chosen populism. And this was probably like 4 or 5 years after Sarah Palin had come on the scene. And which she was the person that I kind of talked about. And I dressed up as her that day, and it was hilarious. And I was able to give a presentation and then preach in her style, which I don't do that if you've ever listened to the sermons on my podcast, that is clearly not what I'm going for. But it was really fascinating to have to try on someone else's mode of communication. And so sometimes when I'm writing a sermon and I'm really stuck, I'll be like, how would Howard Thurman preach this sermon? Or how would, X, Y, or Z preach this text that would be different than how I would? And sometimes that's the only thing I need for me to figure out what my focus statement for that Sunday is. So it was a fun class.
That's beautiful. I know Dr. Smith is a brilliant homiletics professor. Lindsey, I love what you said about teaching leaders how to not just be good Christians, but how to go off into the world and actually be a part of the community. How would you say your class understanding community helped you with that?
Yeah, so the way that the DMin program works is a little bit different than what a lot of the other programs at Candler are like, which is that we don't have the option of which classes do you want to take this term. There's kind of a prescribed, here are the classes you are taking. You get one each semester, and you're also doing all your research at the same time. So it's one of those things where you kind of don't know exactly what you're getting into until you're like in the middle of the class, because it's just, we're taking the next one as it comes along. But the Understanding Community class, which was taught by Kyle Lambelet, was really an exploration in how it is that we can kind of evaluate where a community is, like digging into what's really going on, whether that community is, a congregation, or if it is a local community, kind of whatever that might look like. How is it that you can really dig in and hear people's stories and understand what kind of feedback people are giving to you, and ways of soliciting feedback in different ways, kind of all of those different research pieces, but less focused on like, you're going to do a specific research protocol for the sake of learning something for an academic study, but really, how do you take those tools and those different ways of analyzing what's happening in a community and use it to help further that community for kind of as a formation exercise for community formation, and to help you understand what are some of the underlying challenges and problems that are going on within a community. So it was a really great class because it was not only like helpful stuff as we were doing our research projects, but it's a lot of skill sets that you can take and then use in different contexts in the future. It just kind of was like this really big toolbox that we could then take forward and use however we might use it. And a lot of the things were things that, as somebody with a nonprofit background, I was familiar with, but hearing it contextualized for the church was really, really helpful, because I think that even though the church is, in many ways, aside from being what it is in a holy way, it is also a business. And I don't think that should be a scary thing for us to talk about, that our churches need to be run well. It's one of those things where the difference between a regular old nonprofit and a church, which is also a nonprofit, they're very different. The way that they kind of the motivations and kind of a lot of the things that happen within them are similar, but also very different. So it was helpful to have some of those nonprofit skills and tools contextualized for working within kind of a more explicitly religious space. So yeah, it was a really great kind of like practical, here's some things that you can use in the future kind of a class.
Yeah, no, just recently we started having a class by Professor Dr. Hessler called Financial Management for Churches and Nonprofit. And I know that was a really helpful class because, Jenelle, you mentioned you planted the church. So for a lot of people, some Candler students, they're in their ordination, they're on track, they know where they're going. But for some who find themselves planting churches, or what has happened is Candler students who think they're going into ministry find themselves in nonprofit work, all of a sudden need to know how to manage some of the finances. And thankfully, the pastors are not always the ones fully in charge of that, but you do need to know what's happening in your church. So what are some of this, either of you could answer, what are some skills that you think are imperative for Candler students to gain now, for when they go off into ministry or nonprofit work, skills that might be developing in the low, but you don't realize how critical they are until you get there?
Yeah, my spouse and I were talking about this morning. I think it is a very common phrase for people outside of seminary to be like, well, they didn't teach me that in seminary. Whether it's like how to plunge a toilet or how to, do a spreadsheet, a financial spreadsheet. There are lots of things you don't learn in seminary. But we were talking this morning about like, what are the essential things you do learn? That help you figure those things out afterwards, because I'm so glad they're offering that class. And I did take a nonprofit management and leadership class at Candler, and it was essential to planting a church. Essential. But I also think that what you learn in seminary is how to problem solve. You problem solve theologically. You're going to do a lot of theological problem solving, because people are going to ask you the craziest questions and they're going to have the weirdest religious trauma, and that's okay. So you've got to theologically problem solve. You're going to learn how to problem solve with your schedule. You're going to learn how to problem solve with balancing work and life, which is something you also develop in seminary, because if you don't, you will just die. So I think there are just life practice things that you learn in seminary. We don't give that enough credit. Like, you become a more well-rounded person, and that is essential for ministry. But I do want to give a shout out to taking actual practical courses for managing people and properties and finances. I did not, again, I'm going to use that word pivot. I had no idea when I was going to leave seminary that I would eventually, a couple years later, be asked by the PCUSA to plant a church in Southeast Atlanta. Not a thing I had on my radar at all. But it ended up happening. And immediately, the things in that class that helped were I knew how to create a budget. I knew how to ask people for money. I knew how to do kind of a missional assessment of the neighborhood. Like, what are the needs? What are the assets? Who are the important people who can offer their power in good ways to gather folks and get information about what people actually need in the neighborhood. And so I will say, if you can, I don't know if it's a required course, it should be. But if you can get that course in there, it will set you up for pivots you did not realize were coming, for new opportunities that you never imagined, because our imaginations are so small. Like when I think about my life, would I have thought at 42, I'm having a son graduate and head off to Georgia Tech? Absolutely not. That is ridiculous. I didn't even know if I wanted to have kids, but apparently it happens. So just taking some of those practical courses so that if and when you're asked to do something slightly out of the box, like you're ready for that adventure and it doesn't overwhelm you. You're like, well, I can fudge this. I learned enough. I learned enough. And really, that's kind of seminaries like you're going to learn enough. And then for the next decades, you're just going to keep learning in your parish or in your nonprofit or in these other spaces.
Yeah, I think I would kind of mirror a lot of the things that Jenelle's just said. One of the things, because I do work with a lot of churches within kind of my role at the foundation, I help a lot of our churches around things related to funding outreach ministry, doing fundraising, those kinds of things. So I think, I mean, I wish it was required. I think things that every single person who is going through seminary should learn, because it's going to apply if you're in a church. It's going to apply if you're starting a church, but it's also going to apply if you go into an established church and you're never the person in charge. You might be an associate pastor for 20 years. This is still stuff that's helpful. If you're going in a nonprofit, honestly, even if you're doing something like going into a chaplaincy or something like that, I think the things that are really important to learn: how to read a financial statement, how to actually just, like, when I look at this piece of paper that has all of these numbers on it, what is it and how does it work? On a very basic level, that can be a really, really empowering thing for somebody when they're first coming in and you don't have to take 2 years to figure out how it works. Super basic fundraising skills. I think that even if you are not the frontline person who's going to be doing the fundraising in your church, understanding how the fundraising process works will help you then to also help your volunteers who might be doing a lot of that heavy lifting. This sounds absolutely ridiculous because we all think we know how to do this. How to effectively run a meeting, and what are some of the pitfalls for running a meeting or for meeting planning, depending on what your tradition is.
I'm doing a training for my leaders at church on that right now.
Yeah, it sounds so incredibly basic, and I wish everybody would go take a class on it because I think it's so needed. Depending on your tradition and kind of what your polity looks like, a real basic, what is Robert's Rules of Order and how does that work, would be really helpful. Like, not that you have to be the parliamentarian of anything, but just a super basic understanding of that will go very, very far. And then some really basic, like, people management kinds of skills, like how is it that you can onboard a new employee effectively? How is it that you tell a ministry volunteer that it's time for them to move on to something different? You know, some of that kind of like HR-y kind of stuff that is going to fall into your lap at some point in time. People think that, oh, that's all stuff that gets managed by somebody else, or that's something we'll know what to do when the time comes. It's okay. We'll pray about it and it'll be fine. Sure, yes, you'll figure it out. Prayer is always a good thing, but why would you not set yourself up for success when we know everybody's going to need these skills at some point in time? And this is not like super complicated. You need a very expensive person to explain it to you. Like, go to your local, here in Georgia, in Atlanta, it's the Georgia Center for Nonprofits. I think most states have a nonprofit association that offer classes on basic 101 nonprofit skills. That is like the number one thing I wish that all of our clergy would go and do. So
I feel the career services wheels turning, and I'm like, it would be great if we could get alumni to come and host some of these like little lectures or workshops for Candler students. I want to go back to something that both of you guys kind of mentioned in the beginning in different ways. Jenelle, you mentioned getting pregnant and having to take turns with your spouse of who gets to go to ministry. And then Lindsey, you mentioned waiting to a place where you were financially stable to be able to go back to seminary to get your DMin. And I want to know what advice you have for prospective students who are waiting for this right moment to go to seminary. Because I think both life happens and also children and being able to afford school are very real and valid concerns in the lives of some Candler students. So for some students who are in between that line of they don't know if it's the right time yet, what advice would you have for them?
I am an intuitive decision maker. So I feel like how I make decisions looks very different from, say, my spouse, who is a 10-year plan type of person, which is great. And this is why we're spouses, right? um, for me, I really had to trust that what I wanted was reason enough for our life to be uncomfortable for a while. And so we actually didn't wait to go to grad school until like we were financially stable. I mean, we ended up having a second kid right after that because we're like, if we're in this, we're just going to get naps and diapers over. um, and so my spouse was a PhD student at Emory while I was at Candler as well. So we had a very tight budget. We had a very strict schedule. We had toddlers. And really, it was almost this like my desire to be in seminary was stronger than the discomfort it was causing. And that is going to look different for everyone. I did not grow up with money, so I can tolerate being poor. That is something that I can tolerate. I also, at that point, was in my 20s, which most of my friends have kids in their 30s now, and God bless them, they're so tired. We were in our 20s. We had the energy. We could do the sleep deprivation. So we just decided this is going to be a hard season in our life, and we're just going to push through. Were there consequences? Oh, sure. Did we pay off our undergrad student debt until we were almost 40? We did not. Did our children have to grow up with less than their cousins and their friends and all of the? Yes, they did. But the discomfort of us working part-time and having a very small budget and doing homework, after the kids go to bed and then before they wake up, the payoff for me was very much worth it. I loved my 3 years at Candler. It set me up to do work that was meaningful, and it was a very, very good use of my time. I have no doubt about that. But I think that again, the like, how much do you desire it and how much discomfort are you willing to tolerate? Because I wouldn't start the seminary journey until you're really ready to be in it. It's going to demand a lot of how you think about yourself, how you think about the world, how you think about God. And these are structures that we've built up over time that once you start kind of like pulling at them, don't underestimate how much that's going to take just even emotionally. But it's one of those things that just like makes you grow up. It makes you grow up in beautiful ways. It makes you more creative. It makes you be able to meet people in their own experiences, which are often also chaotic. And so for me, that's basically how we make our decisions. It's like, what is the level of discomfort based on, and then how much is this going to be what we are absolutely supposed to be doing? And honestly, I don't think you can always answer that question before you start it. Like that's too tidy of a problem to solve. But I knew enough. I knew enough that this is what I wanted to do, to make it so that as a family, we would just have a decade of, sometimes not knowing how bills were going to be paid, or not having, all of our vacations were to visit family, and that's okay. But you make sacrifices for the things you really want, and this was something that we both agreed we really, really wanted.
It's interesting because my kind of the way that my career has gone, kind of the choices that I have made. I actually went straight out of undergrad into grad school as well, but that was not seminary. So seminary was my second grad school experience. So I went straight out of undergrad into an MFA program, and I got my MFA in Performing Arts Management, which is basically nonprofit management in an arts organization. And I did that for about 10 years before I discerned the call to go to seminary. And I say all of that to say that I've never felt called to ordination. I've never felt called to going through that process. So when I say that I was called to go to seminary, it means something different than it does for a lot of folks who are making that decision. They're, either saying I'm called into this, and going to seminary is one of those boxes, beautiful, wonderful, rich boxes, but still one of the boxes you have to check on the way to this career path that I'm trying to go down. For a lot of folks, that's kind of where seminary falls into it. So if you know that this is where you're headed and this is one of the things you have to do, that can be a part of the process for making that decision. But I didn't have to go to seminary for my work. That's something that was never required. It was just extra work that I signed up for myself, but I felt like I couldn't not go when I felt that call. And so I say all of that to say that when the time is right, the time is right. And I think that everything that Jenelle just said about knowing, are you prepared to make the sacrifices? Are you prepared to make whatever those lifestyle changes are in order to make that happen? I think that you have to consider all of that. But for me, I had reached a point in my career where I knew that the work I was doing in nonprofit was really important and really critical. And there was a missing piece, that there was something that that I wasn't sure what that was, but there was a faith kind of component that was missing somehow. And I wasn't sure what it was going to take to figure that out. But I just, for whatever the reason, knew that I needed to go and study theology. And even if that did not do a thing for my career, that was fine. The end goal was not, what will I be able to get because I have this degree? It was the journey itself, and actually taking the courses, working through all of that material myself, all of the introspection that you have to do as a part of that process. That was the goal, was to go through all of that. And so for me, figuring out is it the right time or not? Was I in a headspace where I could do that? And if the answer was yes, then it was the right time, figure out the finances or whatever and make it happen. Because the end goal was not the goal. It was the journey was the goal ultimately. And so that's kind of where I was in my seminary experience. So when it came time to thinking about the DMin program and going to Candler, it really was the same thing. That was great. I really learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself. There are things that I'm still not done chewing on. And there is no container in my life where I can chew on these things. This is not stuff directly related to what I do on a day-to-day basis. It's not stuff that my friends are interested in, so I can't go to dinner and chat about it with them. There is still something that I am working on that I feel like I'm supposed to be investigating more deeply, and I needed the container to do that. And so that's when I said, all right, let's sign up for 3 more years of school here, and do this on top of a full-time job and all of the other, running a business and all the other things that I was doing. So it really was, what was my purpose for going to school? And when I was good and clear on that, that's how I knew it was the right time. Because it wasn't about, what am I going to be able to do at the end because of doing this? The answer is absolutely nothing. The number of people who said, oh, now that you've got this degree, what changes about your job? Absolutely nothing changes about my job. That people hated that answer because they wanted to hear what was the fun, shiny thing. And there wasn't one, because there was never supposed to be one. It was the process of going through all of that kind of academic rigorous stuff for me and for where I'm at in my journey. So again, that intuitive piece that Jenelle was talking about, I think that really was it. It was, is this the time? And I knew that it was, even though I knew that would be hard, and it was. There were a lot of things I had to say no to as a result of that, but it was worth it. That was the choice that I made. I knew that was going to be the case. And so it wasn't one of those, oh, I shouldn't have done this now. There's always going to be a reason to not do something. When does it feel like you have to do it? And that's kind of when that moment is.
Both of those are really great questions. I think I'm also chewing on them. It's really amazing. Just the intuitiveness and when does it feel like you have to do something? I think those are the two things that are resonating with me. Um, I even forgot what question I was gonna ask you guys next. Oh yes. Again, I go back to something that just been a recurring theme of just how deeply personal, but also um, transformative theological education is. And that's something a lot of Candler students aren't quite prepared for. Um, so what were some of the things that helped keep you grounded? And both of you were residential. So what was the role of community in that as well? Because like you said, Lindsay, I have some of my friends, my best friends from undergrad, who, as much as I love to rant to them what I learned in class, they listen because they love me, but they don't get it. Um, and so that's where I turn back to Candler to find people to be able to jump down those rabbit holes with.
I can hop in here first. And actually, I was not a residential student. So I am in Atlanta and I happened to take advantage of things like the library in person because I could. But the DMin's program is entirely a hybrid program. It's well, online. We come on campus 3 times over the course of 3 years. So, which is in and of itself is a challenge. What's the community look like when nobody's there in person? And I think that for me, it was you had to get real intentional about what does community look like and how do you intentionally hold space for that community. So it was kind of developing relationships with my classmates that had to exist online and text messages, and emails, Facebook, whatever. So that was a piece of it, was to really intentionally engage that, because we weren't going to kind of organically just run across somebody and grab coffee. Um, but then also one of the things that I did when I was at Candler was that I took advantage of the formation communities that are available at Candler. And for 2 years, I was a part of a hybrid formation community. So we would meet every week online on Zoom as a formation community, and we would have times of intentional prayer outside of those kind of Zoom times and whatnot. But to actually choose to opt into community, because it wasn't going to happen organically the way that it might if you were in classes with somebody and just kind of got to know somebody because you always happen to sit next to them, or you would just walk to class together, and so you get to know somebody. But I think that that's a part of the whole thing with theological education anyway, is it's intentional. And that is, I think, one of the things to be successful in theological education is to approach it with intentionality, because that's how you're actually going to get something out of it. It's what am I supposed to be getting out of this? What am I being challenged by in this moment? What are some things that I might not have thought of before that I'm being confronted with in this moment? And how do I, rather than ignoring those things or arguing against those things, how do I intentionally say, you know what if that was true? What if that was the way that things were supposed to go? What if this other thing that is completely antithetical to what I believe, what if that was right? So that you then are forced to kind of contend with that on your own. So that's kind of intentionality was really the thing that I tried to take that as my approach with a lot of the things I did at Candler. And that's how I had to approach community because we weren't in person together. So yeah.
Um, I have the unique perspective of doing 3 years in intentional seminary housing at Princeton before we came to Candler, because my spouse did his MDiv at Princeton. And so we lived in family housing, and that was lovely. And we made some great friends. And it was really essential for us to have other families with kids around us while Chris was doing his MDiv, et cetera, et cetera. It was fine. I got in, I took one class, and I was like, you're not my people. So, which is why I ended up at Candler, because these are my people. But I think what I learned at Candler, which I have carried with me, and I actually think about it a lot, is just like if you are and maybe maybe at the age of some people at Candler, this is not happening. But if you have, let's say, a financial portfolio, what your financial advisor is going to tell you is diversify, diversify, diversify. You do not want all of your eggs in one basket. You want to make investments in multiple places. And so for me, by the time we got to Candler, Candler was not my only identity. It was not my only significant identity. And so as a student, I love my time at Candler. I love being on campus. I loved every class. I love the professors. I'm a pretty good student. So it was my jam. But I also, for part of my day, was a mom. I also, for part of my day, we were pretty active at our church. I was a person who was active at that church, and I had people at that church who we were close to who were never going to go to seminary. And so having my grounding and my identity and my relationships be spread across different aspects of who I am, and like I called my mom once a week, I felt like that is what kept me afloat. I did not have all of my identity and community in one place. I had diversified my assets, which I will say is 100% essential to being a pastor. I know that if I'm getting stressed at work, it's probably related to how much time I'm spending with or not spending with my neighbors who don't go to my church, right? Or have I talked to my family? Have I called them? Have I connected with them? Do I have places where my identity is not someone's caregiver or pastor? And so diversifying where you are getting fed is so important. It cannot all be Candler. Like it can't. I would be overwhelming and unreliable in some ways. And so making sure that you're getting love from different places and you're getting good conversation and different kinds of conversation in many different places in your life. I think that was something that was actually like I didn't have a choice because I came as a young parent. But now I see it was a huge gift to be forced to really have relationships built in many different parts of my life.
That's beautiful, and I think really important answers and things to keep in mind, especially as students start or are halfway through their time here at Candler. Um, Before we go, I would like to know if you guys have any last minute words or any last minute pieces of advice that you guys would like to share with the Candler community.
I was able to catch Dr. Ellison's lecture on Wednesday. And I think what I really appreciated about his particular presentation on the future of religious education, but honestly, I'm not a student anymore. So I took it in many other ways as well, is the importance of imagination, the importance of imagining what if something goes right, imagining something beautiful, imagining that you're going to actually get a job that's going to be beneficial. It might not be the first year you get out of seminary, but you're going to get there eventually. I really appreciated just how so much so much we just accept and we think it's always going to be like this, or everything is static, and that's not true at all. The opposite is true. Like we live in a world of possibilities. And so I really hope that theological education can stay imaginative, but that we, especially now, can all like take up imaginative space, because we're getting a lot of messages about the way things are. And good God, I hope they're not true. There are other ways to imagine our future together.
I think one of the things that I would recommend really to anyone, but I think people who are going through seminary or who are contemplating seminary, this is applicable for them, is that don't take for granted that whatever sort of, if it's a volunteer thing, if it's, you're doing CPE, if it's you're actually graduated and you are placed in a congregation or in a ministry context of some kind, don't take for granted that whatever it is that you're doing is actually going to be spiritually fulfilling for you. our spiritual fulfillment does not necessarily come from our work, even though our work can be a part of that. So I would say to really think about, where is it that you personally find God? And that does not have to be in some prescribed, it's this particular kind of prayer thing that I learned how to do, and this is the right way to pray. It's not, oh, we're always supposed to go to services on Sunday morning, and if I've done that, then that's my spiritual life. Is it when I have a cup of coffee first thing in the morning out on my back porch and I can hear the birds? That's where I find God. Okay, great. If that's where you find God, intentionally choose to do that. Don't give that up because you're busy. Don't give that up because you don't have time. Don't give that up because you're thinking of a million things, or because today you're really focused on your phone. Like, really think through, what are the things that you find to be spiritually meaningful, and make sure that you keep those intentionally as a part of your daily rhythm, your weekly rhythm, your monthly rhythm, whatever that might be. Because just because you are working in something that is church related doesn't inherently mean that you actually are engaged spiritually. And everyone's walk looks different. They are all valid. And so just to intentionally make sure that you are lifting that up and taking that with you, because that's between you and God. And if you take anything and intentionally look at it that way, it doesn't matter if it's a part of the church or not. Anything can be a spiritual experience. And so I tell people to be very intentional about that, because it's very easy to look past, because we are all so busy, and we all have, thoughts and assumptions about what things are supposed to look like. So that will be more kind of, I think, fulfilling for you long term than any other specific thing I could particularly recommend. So
Once again, I feel like I need to take this advice as much as I'm excited for other students who will get to hear this later on through different mediums. But Jenelle and Lindsey, thank you so much for joining us today, for taking your time to give back and answer questions and still staying connected with the Candler community. We deeply appreciate it.